They numbered us all off on our knees and gave Tony Blair half an hour, and every half an hour one would be shot.
I was carrying a cuckoo clock that I'd bought locally, and I heard it was men from One Royal Irish, and I thought, right, and I went launched down the corridor.
A West Side boy staggering out his house. It's only then they started to react, but it was too late.
Welcome to a very special edition of the Old Paratrooper podcast. Cast your minds back a little over 25 years ago. Sierra Leone, West Africa. A brutal civil war is raging, tension is rising, and a group of Royal Irish soldiers find themselves in grave danger. I'm of course talking about Operation Barras, which took place on the 10th of September, the year 2000. A daring rescue mission carried out by Special Forces, the Parachute Regiment, and attachments from the Royal Air Force and the Royal Navy. The objective? To rescue the captured Royal Irish soldiers and their Sierra Leonean comrades who were held by the infamous West Side Boys militia. What followed has gone down in Special Forces, Parachute Regiment and British Army history as one of the most extraordinary operations ever conducted. Today, we're privileged to be joined by three remarkable guests. Retired Colonel Tim Collins, OBE, who at the time was working closely with Special Forces, and he will be giving us an insight into the command decisions and the planning behind the operation itself. Former Royal Irish soldier Ian Getty, who was one of the hostages captured during the ambush, he'll recount what it was like to be at the hands of the West Side Boys. And finally, former Parachute Regiment soldier Gary Simpson, who took part in the assault on the village of Macbenny, while the SES closed in on the hostage camp itself. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining me. Absolute pleasure to be speaking to you on this topic. Tim, thank you so much for inviting us into your amazing home. It's more like a museum, but thank you very much. What I'd like to do is I'd like to get a bit of a background about the history of Sierra Leone, the start of the Civil War and the events leading up to Op Barras itself. So yeah, over to you, Tim.
Well, Sierra Leone, and the name means the Mountains of the Lion, was a sparsely inhabited part of the world until it became of interest in 1834 when the Parliament of the United Kingdom outlawed slavery worldwide. And so the role of the Royal Navy for the next 100 years until the First World War was to free slaves across the world, and they had the East Africa Squadron, the West Africa Squadron. But the problem that they had, amongst other things, is what do you do with slaves that you've rescued? And I think something like 150,000 slaves were rescued. And they identified Sierra Leone as a place where it had a deep port where you could land people ashore where they could find a new life. And of course, a lot of these people couldn't speak the same language. So one of the first things they did, they set up the first hospital in Africa was set up in Sierra Leone, and the town was appropriately called Freetown. They set up the first university in Africa for black people only, was established in Freetown, so it was a free port. Then later it was important in the First World War and the Second World War, often called the Gibraltar of the Atlantic, because that's where ships could go and refettle in order to protect convoys in the Atlantic and the fight against submarines. But Sierra Leone was given independence in 1961, and by 1961, it was called the Switzerland of Africa. It was an extremely wealthy part of the world. The leone, which was the currency, was on par with the pound, and people lived a good life there, and it was one of the thriving, Freetown was a thriving port, again with a university and a very sophisticated hospital. That's when things started to go wrong, and far from me to judge how things happen in Africa. By really 1994, I think Sierra Leone was number 44 of the 44 basket cases for the United Nations and the World Health Organization. Wow. It was a completely failed state. Oddly enough, a number of subversive groups grew up. One of them, the Revolutionary United Front, the RUF. Amongst their other schemes at one stage was to restore the British Empire under a guy called Fodo Calais, but they kept changing their mind about what they wanted. There was various attempts to establish, and there was a democracy of sorts and a parliament, etc. But and there'd been a number of crises, and the British forces had been involved in services of assisted evacuations on a number of occasions. But the thing about them always was that it was evacuations from the port of Freetown, but always the assumption was that the airport at Lungi was always opened. So what changed in 2000 was that the Revolutionary United Front found themselves with a golden opportunity. What had actually happened was that the government of Sierra Leone had invited a mercenary company called Executive Outcomes, who are mainly South Africans, to come and deal with their problem. And they paid the South Africans. And something like 150 South Africans turned up in Sierra Leone, and they drove the United Front to the very borders of Liberia and Guinea, Conakry, which are on the border of Sierra Leone. And at that stage, it looked like the West Side Boys, and indeed the revolution, the war was over. At that stage, Tony Blair's government got themselves involved, and they're very modern and right on. And the Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs, Cook, said to the Sierra Leone government they shouldn't be dealing with mercenaries because these weren't nice people. That what they wanted to do was something more ethical. And they said, what we suggest. I said, the United Nations, they're hip and right on. And so the Executive Outcomes were invited to leave Sierra Leone, and the United Nations were invited to come into Sierra Leone to be the occupying force. And of course, the United Nations, which is half-assed at best, arrived there. And the rebels of the Revolutionary United Front looked up and they thought, oh, that's good. Here come the UN. That's a money-making opportunity because these guys are useless. So they took most of the United Nations contingents hostage, and including, it was amusing because I remember on the periphery being part of the planning and our Ministry of Defence, I think they captured the Kenyan contingent. And we had to say to the contingents, how many people have you actually got there? Because we're going to try and rescue them. Now, we don't care how many people you're charging for and drawing wages for. We need to know how many people are actually there in order that we can rescue them. Because what nations, in fact, particularly African nations, would do is that they would put a bunch of people in, then say there's 10,000 of them, draw the wages on them. And being United Nations, no one looked too closely at the bill. But anyway, we had a significantly difficult situation where the fact that the United Nations, being utterly useless as they are, was collapsing all around. And the big difference this time was the Revolutionary United Front were advancing on Freetown. And as they did so, they went to villages. Anyone who had any dealings with the government or the dealings with the United Nations or not, they didn't really care. These guys were high on drugs most of the time. And they would say to them, would you like long sleeves or short sleeves? And depending on the answer you give, they would hack your hand off either there or there. So those are long sleeves, those are short sleeves. And so they then would burn the village. So what we had in May of 2000, and well, it was late April, 1st of May 2000, was large groups of amputee refugees making their way towards Freetown in a desperate state. And the United Nations, by that stage, administratively, military, and every other way, had completely collapsed. But the big difference on this occasion was they were heading towards Lungi Airport. And if they closed the airport, there was no hope of rescuing the people from Sierra Leone at all. There was no hope of getting anybody who was inside Sierra Leone out at all. It was the end of hope. And the likelihood would be that the surviving people of the town of Freetown and the citizens of Sierra Leone and the United Nations as well, who were gathered together like terrified children, would be slaughtered. And at that stage, there was no choice, but the United Kingdom had to mount a rescue operation. And that was put together very quickly. HMS Ocean was turned around in the Mediterranean and sent steaming as fast as it could towards the Atlantic and towards Sierra Leone. And at that stage, the United Kingdom Armed Forces were pretty joined up. And an operation was put together at high speed to mount a rescue operation. Cut a long story short, a services assisted arrived. I think it was one parachuted into Lungi Airport. and established a perimeter very quickly. The RUF, and of course you had thousands and thousands of United Nations forces gathered there trembling, but a platoon from the Pathfinders, the Parachute Regiment, landed, took on the Revolution United Front, knocked the crap out of them, quite frankly, and they didn't come back for more. And at that stage, we realised that we'd stabilised the situation. And by that stage, we were getting more parachute people and special forces on the ground. Marines landed from ocean, and the situation was stabilised. But at that stage, it was decided that the next thing to do was to re-establish the nation of Sierra Leone under its own steam. And the plan was for two. First of all, British forces were there to try and find some safe refuge for the United Nations forces to hide and be in safety. And also then to establish a new Sierra Leonean army. And part of that establishing a new Sierra Leone army was that on the auspices of the British assistance, they looked out to the remnants of the old Sierra Leonean army and also groups that had helped defeat, because there's a number of groups that once the British had arrived, joined in to help the Sierra Leonean government, like the Camajors and others, to push the Revolutionary United Forces back. And so a training mission was set up in Sierra Leone, and the contribution the British made to that was to provide infantry battalions who were there to protect the capital Freetown, and were there to train the Sierra Leone army to such an extent that they could look after themselves. But things weren't out of the woods by any means by that stage. There was another incident in a place called Kailahun, where a Indian Army battalion of the 8th Gurkha Rifles, Seymour Rifles, were surrounded by the Revolutionary United Front, and the Indians wanted to mount a rescue operation, but they had no means to really do so. And so the British planners helped the Indians plan a mission, and the Royal Air Force provided the Chinook helicopters to bring the Indian Army troops into Kailahun. They successfully relieved the siege of Kailahun. The Revolutionary United Front again took another hammering and battering, and it looked by that stage like the situation was relatively settled. And to that extent, and you could say that the Revolutionary United Front as an organisation was gently leaving the stage. However, what we didn't realise at that stage was that there was other groups, including a group who called themselves the West Side Boys. And for the purposes and the political correct world that we live in, we'll call them the West Side Boys. That's not what they called themselves because they modelled themselves on American gangster rappers.
Right.
But these American gangster rappers, the boys, they use a different word, but they were heavily into drink and drugs. And it was a Jordanian contingent from the United Nations was in that relatively area. Amusingly, the Jordanian contingent had originally been skilled to go to Kosovo, but at the last minute it was switched and they were sent to Sierra Leone. So many of them thought they were actually in Kosovo. They wouldn't really have known the difference. But they had tried to establish relationships with the West Side Boys and been unsuccessful with that. And so it came about that one of the battalions that was training the Sierra Leonean Army, the Royal Irish Regiment, 1st Battalion Royal Irish Regiment was there, and they thought that they would send a reconnaissance troop to go to the West Side Boys and see if they would like to come and join and be part of the new Sierra Leonean Army. And the story starts there.
And it unfolds. I remember, because Op Pallister was the one, I was on Op Pallister myself, and I remember the quick turnaround. I think it was like within 24 hours, troops on the ground. And I think the West Side Boys then pushed back into the Ochra Hills and sort
That was the RUF did, yeah. So the
RUF,
West Side Boys essentially were a gangster group amongst other gangster groups that were on the periphery of things, but they were not part of the RUF. And it was basically a bunch of lost boys who had got weapons, banded together in order to protect themselves from the West Side Boys. And the position that they had found themselves at a place called Rokel Creek was somewhere that would be very hard to attack. So had the RUF come for them, they would have been relatively secure. But the thing was that the RUF had no interest, and they're more interested in Freetown. So there was this group of armed boys who were living in this camp, and it had been identified as somewhere where there's a large group of men. And I can tell you, we assessed there to be 381 of them, because we looked closely at that, and that was the number of people that were roughly there. What we didn't realise at that stage is that they had done a bit of their own banditry. They'd taken hostages from the local area, and they had a number of Africans as hostage-stroke slaves,
Right.
or people they were coercing to become part of their group. And that was an element that we weren't aware of at the time.
Yeah. Well, that leads us on to, obviously, you out there as a training role, is that right? A sort of liaising with the...
Myself personally, no. Obviously, the battalion was doing the training.
Right, okay.
I'd spent, I can't remember exactly how many months, but I was part of I think it was a defence platoon.
Okay.
So stagging on. That's, yeah, basically stagging on. The odd patrol into Freetown, admin patrol. And actually that day, if I'll jump straight to the day, that was my first that day was my first proper patrol.
Right.
So I remember in the morning we went into the hills, I'm guessing around Freetown somewhere, looking for OP sites. And, a pretty basic patrol, but something completely different. We're finally out patrolling in a bit of jungle. And then in the afternoon, they put this patrol together to kind of get, I think, probably as far forward towards what would have been roughly the front line, and certainly Tim, you'll know more about that than me, but to get out towards where the UN positions and stuff were, which we did. So yeah, out we went, 11 of us and Musa, the LO, went up to the Jordanians to sort of get an idea of what's happening, where they are and what's going on, had lunch with them, and started to make our way back. At this point, I'll dispel a myth that's been there for 35 or 25 years.
Go for it.
We weren't lost.
Right, okay.
We weren't lost. We got you couldn't get lost. It was one road straight back in.
Right.
We got to the turn off to the west side, boys, and again, as Tim's alluded to, they were gangsters, but they weren't directly linked to the RUF. And if I remember rightly, they were sort of classed as roughly friendly forces in our int briefs, or possible friendly forces. And yeah, the OC made the decision to turn up and go and see them. Obviously, being a ranger back then, I was sat in the back of the wagon. I'm just nodding dog at that point. So I don't know if that had been, I still don't know to this day if that was a decision that was made before we left or if it was a kind of spur of the moment.
Right.
But the idea was to drive up. Now, again, the controversy around that decision, Musa had said to us, don't go up there. It's a world of trouble. And we'd kind of ignored that. And, I don't know the answer. I always have said, seek local knowledge.
Of course.
But the flip side of that is if we turned around every time somebody got a bit nervous about something in the British Army, we'd never go anywhere.
Well, you wouldn't. It's true. Yeah, true.
So, we made the call to go, and we turned up the track. It's kind of it's a typical dirt track. It's about one vehicle wide, and the jungle's pretty dense on either side. And I honestly can't remember, maybe 10 minutes driving. But the instant we pulled just right to the edge of the village where it opens out into the clearing, just surrounded. I'm going to say my conservative estimate is 150 of them.
How many of you? There was 11 of you.
11 of us.
Wow.
So we were in 3 vehicles. We had a standard Land Rover at the front, Wimmick in the middle, and another Land Rover, sort of the FFR at the back. And it was instant. And I would say it was planned because they had what do they call it, a technical, like a pickup truck with the douchkas that came in behind as a cutoff. And there was an instant decision to be made there. sort of everyone here will know when you hit an ambush, straight into it, just go noisy. And one of the Rangers in the back of my wagon, the front wagon, came very close. I mean, a second away from opening fire.
Could have been a very different story if that happened.
Would have been dead.
Yeah.
There's no doubt about it. We wouldn't have made it out. And the OC made the call really quickly. No, don't fire. And then it became a couple of minutes of a bit of a scuffle. The OC and the Sergeant Major, had got out the front of the wagon. Me and sort of one of the other Rangers were out the back. And I think they were a wee bit as confused as us at that point. They came round to take our weapons and essentially got told, no, we weren't giving our weapons up. And maybe a couple of minutes of that sort of, like a public order type sort of jostling kind of a thing. But then the OC came round and he'd had taken a couple of hits, and him and the Sergeant Major, their weapons were gone, and he'd made the decision, hand over the weapons before it escalates any further. And it sort of moved pretty quickly from there. We were taken, my memory's hazy, but we were taken either into a building close by or maybe just outside the building. And at that point, a UN helicopter came over, which absolutely spooked them. And they kind of made the decision there on the spot, get them straight down to the river, into the boats, and over to Barrybana. And so probably within an hour, we were in Barrybana, in the White House, which I can come on to later, in the first cell. And yeah, that was sort of the beginning of the next 17 days.
Yeah, I mean, it's a difficult one. You're massively outnumbered. You're not unsure. Obviously, the right decision was made at that time, because obviously, like I said, it had been a different story. So how quickly for you, Tim, were you made aware that obviously this had happened? Was it kind of quite quick passage of information back to kind of SF that this had happened?
Actually, I was on holiday in Germany, believe it or not, and the first I heard about it was on the radio. I just got off the ferry in Dover and was driving back to my house in London, and with my 5 small children, and I heard this that there'd been British soldiers taken hostage, and then I can remember walking into my house in Wandsworth. I was carrying a cuckoo clock that I'd bought locally and the radio was on in the kitchen. I heard it was men from One Royal Irish, and I thought, right, and I went fucking launched down the corridor, and I thought, what are they doing? And so the whole planning process had to start, and the what I can't get is any detail of special forces, but to say in that when something like that happens in the nation, that problem always lands with special forces. And during my time, I'd seen a number of different things, but on this particular occasion, I knew the people who were. I'd commanded C Company in One Royal Irish, so I knew everybody in it.
So it's a bit personal to you.
Yeah,
as
so
well.
it was in that regard. Then you have to rise above that, and so very quickly, Cobra, the Cabinet Office briefing room was set to meet and to look at what the nation was going to do about it. And there was a number of there was big worries at the time but there was a number of positives. 2 key positives that came out of the initial planning at the Ministry of Defence with government as well was, first of all, that the guys hadn't reacted by firing, because that would have led to loss of life on both sides. And that was avoided, and we were pleased about that because we believed we could handle the situation, or certainly ready to give it a good go. And the other thing by that stage, I think this was day 3 of the hostage-taking situation, is that the Royal Irish Regiment hadn't lost a single day's training for the Sierra Leonean Army. Everything elsewhere had gone on as normal. And so there's a big message went out, not only to the in Sierra Leone, to the local people, but to the world, that you can mess with the British Army, but you're not actually going to upset what we do. And so the training continued unabated. And that was a big relief. Our big worry was that there'd be some overreaction to the situation and things would grind to a halt, and that would send the wrong message. That hadn't happened. And so then planning got underway, and planning, as always, looked at the course of least resistance. And so very quickly, I remember meeting in London with two gentlemen from the Metropolitan Police who were specialist negotiators. And the plan was made there and then that we would fly these Metropolitan Police special negotiators down to Sierra Leone, where they could take part in the negotiations to see if we could negotiate an end to this hostage crisis and understand what was going on and see if we could come to some accommodation.
Okay. Yeah, so negotiations and stuff like the initial sort of planning. For you, Ian, obviously we talked about 3 days in. What were the sort of initial kind of treatment? Was it like, because we talked before, obviously behind the scenes, about you had some circumstances where you created rapport, but what was the initial treatment like? Was it, I imagine, and obviously I know it's a bit of a difficult topic to kind of talk about, but...
No, I mean, look, you get that shock of capture, that happens. Everyone gets that. It's that weird feeling of suddenly being completely out of control. It's not in your hands. But I think we started reacting to it pretty well, pretty quickly. So, like individuals even, for example, one of the Rangers on the Wimmick kind of disabled the 50 cal before he got pulled off the Wimmick.
Right.
So little wins like that. I remember all sort of going through my head was to rip my para wings off, because the OC had para wings and he'd had the worst beating. And thinking weird things, like thinking I'm not going to throw these in the ground in case they find them and think there's a rescue coming in. So I stuck them down my pants. Obviously, remember we all wore twisters in the day.
Yeah.
So they just sat in the bottom of the twisters. I came unstuck about 2 weeks later with them when they found them, but little things like that. And yeah, like I say, we sort of straight very quickly over to Barrybana and stuck in this room. I've always said that they were as confused as us, the West Side boys. I think deep down somewhere there was possibly something in them that maybe they knew they'd bitten off, maybe they knew it was a silly move. Or maybe they just didn't know what to do with us, because we weren't your average hostage from a local village. But we, they were all over the place. I mean, but then, as we discussed sort of earlier, the reality came pretty hard and fast there. So not long after we were taken, hours, maybe less, we saw a local being brought in covered in blood. And yet, like we said, that night, he was tortured to death in the room beside us. So this was obviously a prison building they used. And I would say clearly a tactic for us to bring him in and do it inside, in the room beside us. So we spent that night listening to that. Obviously not understanding anything that was said, but just someone being tortured. It's a noise you won't forget.
Well, it's gonna play havoc with you mentally, and it's like, yeah.
But I have to say very quickly, the senior ranks there stepped up. So I'll never forget the OC said to us all, "Don't worry about it. That guy's sick. He's got malaria." And deep down it's nonsense, but it's enough to kind of take the edge off, if that's the right word. So yeah, and then they took them out and they shot him. And again, as we discussed, it turns out he was a West Side boy who'd just come off leave at the wrong time and got the blame for guiding us to the camp. I'm not sure if they thought their camp was top secret or something and were amazed that we'd found it. But that was the first night. And then it kind of became a bit of a battle of wills over the next 17 days. There was a bit of routine. We tried to keep our own routine as well, obviously, just to help. But they would sort of let us out outside the building during the day. they'd kick off at about 4 every day because that's when the drugs and drink really kicked in. So you'd know what was coming at that time of the day. But it was sort of like a ping pong of them doing crazy stuff, the negotiations going on, and us just trying to get little wins wherever we could, and that could be anything. Just getting through the day was a win, but
with like food and water and stuff like that, obviously supplying you with food and water, or how was that kind of?
So they let us, like I say, they weren't, they didn't search as well. I had my map and compass for about 2 weeks still, but we still had I think we had our anti-malarial stuff, and we had our Puri tabs. So we were using Puri tabs for food. We got like I think it was a mess tin of rice and this green stuff they eat. Still don't know what it is.
Okay.
And we had 1 spoon, so we used to do like 2 bites and then pass it on and just pass it round. So we got that once a day. That was the food. And we had smokes. The British Army, once the negotiations got going, were saying that they were trying to smuggle in cigarettes inside, the hexie cookers.
Yeah.
The West Side boys clocked that, but again, weirdly, they took the good cigarettes out of the hexies and gave us the local stuff. So we used to, we had wee wins like that, just having a smoke. And that sort of chaotic, it was a routine, it was chaotic, but it was a bit of a routine.
That's what I was going to ask you,
yeah.
Having a routine, did that help it?
We tried to maintain a routine, and it's weird to say, for 17 days, a lot of it was very, very boring. Certainly for like the Rangers and stuff, because we weren't that involved. We could do our own wee bits. Obviously, the guys were then going to the negotiations. So they would go out every day, do the negotiations, and come back. So something a bit different from them. But a lot of it was mundane's not the right word, but it was a lot of just sitting around, interspersed with just moments of chaos. So, the mock executions being a big one.
Yeah.
And, I have to say, physically, it wasn't that bad for us. There wasn't a lot of beatings or anything like that. I think I got maybe butt stroked once, and that's when they found the para wings. And obviously, they've some idea what the para wings were, because as we said earlier, the Pathfinders had just kicked their arse a few months before. Yeah. So, but yeah, that's really how it sort of played out. It was a lot of sitting around, kind of smoking, trying to get the little wins, the odd moment of madness, and then just sort of trying to work out what had come from the negotiations and where we were.
Did you find at any point, did you see the situation sort of improving or deteriorate where you thought, shit, things are kind of deteriorating here, or does that make sense?
Only based on their drinking and the drugs.
Right. Okay.
4 o'clock, we called it the witching hour. Something was going to happen. It probably, if you look at it over the 17 days, as the days went on, it started to get worse. I think they started to get a bit more confident, up to the point where the day before the rescue, they tried to capture the negotiating team. So it probably got a bit worse as the days went on, but the main escalations were, they just went from 0 to hero. And very unpredictable, apart from the sort of rough time it would happen, but it would be, I can't remember exactly, but I'm certainly asked one day for Tony Blair to do something, and they numbered us all off on our knees and gave Tony Blair half an hour, and every half an hour one would be shot. Absolutely ludicrous stuff. There was another day where they did an interview with the BBC World Service, and they told the World Service live on the radio, here's the OC, he's going to speak, and he refused to speak. And again, it was a bad day for us. And I remember us almost arguing with the OC, get on the radio or they're going to kill us. But in the end, it was the right decision because it put a message out, whether it needed to be done or not, but it put a message out across the world that things were not well in Barras. So, yeah, like I say, those were at my level, on a personal basis, I was watching out for those little escalations. Obviously, there was things at a much higher level going on and changes and stuff, but for me, it was day to day. What's coming next?
Striking up a bit of a rapport and stuff like that. I bet that was. Was you able to pinpoint like key figures within that sort of group? Like any leaders, or was it sort of free reign?
No, they definitely had. They had a command structure. Callie, who ran the West Side Boys, we didn't see much. They had a few others, sort of various, what I don't know, like
Bomb Blast,
Calm Down Fresh,
Cambodia,
yeah. One called Dennis, who I.
And Dennis.
Dennis is the one. Again, we spoke about it. I took the piss out of him because he wore a Man United shirt. Probably a bit risky because he was, well, they were all lunatics, but I think he was known as a real special lunatic. But it was just, I don't even know if it's building a rapport. I tried to chat to them in their broken English. And I do know that on the last night, Calm Down Fresh was on it. He was absolutely off his nut, but he was pointing at the sky and talking about stuff. And eventually I worked out that he was trying to point out satellites.
Yeah.
I sort of had a bit of a laugh with him and he promoted me. I think I got head of security that night.
Right.
Just in time. I'm glad he didn't actually enforce it, or I'd have been on the other side of the rescue. But that was, I didn't have much to give out there. I looked after the cigarettes and tried my best to sort of build that rapport with them, and just, that really was what just put a bit of effort in to understand them. There was, I think other people struggled a bit more to talk to them. They were a bit, because they were horrible people.
Yeah.
And then kind of other people had sort of other things in their mind as well. The OC, his brain must have been racing for 17 days. Absolutely racing and under pressure. And I've talked about this before. We mentioned it in Sierra Leone when we went back, and we had a discussion about, the mock executions and were you ready to fight back? And I'll say I wasn't. I was frozen to the spot. It didn't enter my head to fight back. I don't know what the psychological reason is, but I spent every one of those sort of seconds on my knees waiting, thinking, what's the OC going to do here? What's the get out clause?
I think people look at it and go, why are you letting that happen? Why are you not doing everything to resist? But you kind of, not that your will's been broken, but you're in a position, like you say, you kind of adrenaline kicks in and you freeze. And yeah, it's difficult probably for people that have never been in that situation to understand, isn't it?
I think it's just a freeze response. And I think as well, somewhere deep down, if you fight back, you're definitely dead. As long as you're on your knees, you're still alive. I don't know. It was a weird one to be in. But yeah, I was.
But you were seeing it from one. There was a, not surprisingly, very quickly, the United Kingdom used all its technical resources to try and assess pretty much what was going on and what was happening, and that was both technical and physical. In that, with the assistance of the Sierra Leoneans, they were able to get some information out on the ground because people were coming and going from the location. Without getting into too technical, the things that are modern with radar mapping, etc., you can actually see the hill. So we weren't relying on cloud cover, but you can actually see through cloud. So there's a pretty good idea of what the layout of the place was and where people were. But the important thing was that very early on, it became clear from the informants that we're talking was that the hostage takers had become frightened of the hostages because of the dignity with which they conducted themselves. So the whole aspect that unknown to them, that with the O.C. Alan Marshall not talking to them, a number of anecdotes which were passed on to us, but generally, and even through the mock execution, the dignity with which the soldiers had behaved was actually having an effect on the hostage takers, and that was scaring them. And indeed, what is remarkable, even though that no recognition has ever been given for the men of the Royal Irish who went in to the hostage situation, and I think I'm right in saying you had no resistance to interrogation or training or any hostage training.
I think we had what's the mat that we do every year, the name, rank, number sort of bit, I think.
So that was it. But what the British Army now trains its people to do in interrogation is based on what these guys made up as they went along in Sierra Leone. So the way in which the hostages conducted themselves and the dignity, which they just found from within themselves, is what we teach people to do now. And indeed, not fighting back, being stoic, that was frightening the hostage takers.
Yeah, I bet, yeah. So what sort of intelligence sources did you have feeding information back?
All sorts.
All sorts from, can you...
No.
No, okay. That's fair enough.
What had happened, again, it's open source and everybody knows, is that the hostage negotiations had gone on. The commanding officer of One Royal Irish, Simon Fordham, he had become the sort of central figure which they focused on as the negotiators, and the decision was taken at a high level that if that's the person they had a rapport with, let him do. So the two Metropolitan Police negotiators were feeding him the lines to take, but he was the focus because they'd clearly established a rapport. And the negotiations ebbed and flowed, and at one stage there was a negotiation where there was to be a release, but one of the things, again, we learned what we already knew, it was that negotiating with terrorists is not a good idea. And if anything, whenever the hostages were released and they were given in exchange satellite telephones and allowed to talk to the World Service, where they told people that they all wanted to come to Britain and settle down and be students, but you can't read and write. Anyway, the thing was that we realised that they became anything wackier and weirder. And I think one of the sources we had was that you all got promoted to colonel as well. And you suddenly realise we're not dealing with people who are irrational. But at that stage, you could see a breakdown of the relationships to the point where it came on the Friday. By that stage, that things had broken down, and there was this attempt to take other hostages, and we knew at that stage that things had come to a head. And at that stage, it wasn't entirely clear even if the hostages would survive. And there was a period of about 48 hours where there was no contact with any from within, and the question was left hanging: are these people even alive anymore? So, but the takeaway from that is even giving small concessions in negotiations can often be a bad idea.
There were 5 released, and maybe a bit controversial. I don't know if it had ever been mentioned. I think it was like an assumption that some of us made that it would start from the bottom, the Rangers, and then 4 Rangers and a Lancejack. But because the number 5 had been randomly picked by the West Side boys, the 5 married ones were picked to go. But you get on with it. What actually happened was 2 of those married ones were signallers. So they got sent back because, the West Side boys had our radios now, and I think they might have had some legacy stuff from before, but our signallers were keeping the British Army radios they had running.
Right.
So then we came to need another 2 to send out. So the OC obviously said he's not going. And the Int Sergeant, he was there, volunteered to stay. It's one of the hardest things I've ever seen done in real life.
An act of huge courage.
Absolutely, yeah.
I don't know how he did it.
No recognition whatsoever.
Really?
Nothing.
God.
And yeah, right up there with some of the bravest things I've ever seen. To volunteer to stay in when you could go out. So the 4 Rangers drew straws. I've never won anything in my life. And I wasn't going to win this one. But I've always said it's proper Jack, but the other ranger that was kept in, I'd known since we were kids. He lived near me, and I was never as glad to see him lose as well. You know, just to have that mate. It's there, but that's how the other two were picked. And then I think again, I only learned this a few months ago. I think when they got the phone and they'd agreed to 5 hostages, they suddenly decided, we're not going to do the release. And I think there was a bit of negotiation between the OC and the RSO and stuff, saying if you want these negotiations to go further, they have to work both ways. You know, you've only got a phone, you want more, you're going to have to release the 5. So, long story short, those 5 got, they got out that day, and that sort of left 6 of us and Musa wherever he was. He wasn't with us anymore.
He'd been separated from you.
Yeah, I mean, we've talked about the treatment he got. I'll always say it wasn't that physically that bad for us. For him, it was horrendous.
Beatings and
just proper torture, and he was kept tied up in a pit. So it's like going back to see that pit a few months ago. It was just like a shallow grave with a bit of a roof on it. So he was kept in there. So he really had a hard time physically and mentally. But we didn't see him for 17 days.
Wow.
And then shortly after that, we were moved down to a new building. So we'd been in the White House, I can't remember exactly, 5 or 6 days. And then we were moved down to the bottom of the village, which is where we met Calm Down Fresh in Cambodia and a few of the other nice people.
So for a point, I mean, it looked like negotiations were working. You've had some released, and then obviously at some point there was a breakdown, the demands got ridiculous, and then at which point a decision was made, obviously, to mount the rescue mission itself. At which point, again, with the parachute regiment, were you made aware that something was going to happen? Because you said before it wasn't initially...
No, it wasn't. Firstly, thanks for having us on the podcast. It's
absolutely.
So, as you've already said, I was A company. I was a lance corporal, in those days, a young lance corporal. But so we didn't really know what was going on. A bit of pretext. Tim mentioned Pallister, the build up to that, what happened, and it was one para who got sent as the battle group to go there. But we as A company were in Jamaica at the time on exercise.
And a company of 2 para.
Exactly,
that was
that's why you went. Yeah, exactly. So it was a bit controversial at the time. We sort of got off a saddle on, out in Jamaica, saying, one para's gone and they've left one of their companies behind. But in the grand scheme of things, I suppose in inverted brackets, we were jungle training. Whatever sort of jungle there is in Jamaica, but we were out there anyway. So we came back from Jamaica, and I'll get to the point in a second. A bit of egg on our face, thinking, a bit annoyed that the battalion gone. Pallister had finished; it was relatively quick, a success. Like Tim said, the Pathfinders went in and done what they had to do to the RUF, and the battalion was back, and we were that company who hadn't gone on operations because we were on exercise. But little did we know, the fact we'd been to Jamaica and had that limited part of jungle training, we were well positioned then to be the company which was chosen to go on the hostage rescue mission, because to get to the point, the question you asked, we did not have a clue that we were selected to go and do this mission. Right until the time we were released from South Cerney, the Air Mountain Centre, which I'll get to. So how do we end up in that position? We were told we were going on exercise with the guards, exercise fastball they called it. If I do recall, I may have the name wrong. And we all moaned at the time, saying, "Look, the guards are that undermanned. They can't get a company together, and they need to use one of our companies to achieve the exercise aim." But the smarter ones amongst us thought something isn't quite right, because we're going on exercise with the guards, but they're issuing us all this jungle kit. Back in Dover, we were based in Dover at the time. But we rolled with it. You need to remember, this was back in the days, before everyone had a mobile phone. Before there was such a thing as, all this social media outlets. So the OPSEC was quite good, but by the nature of A, we were told not to say anything, and B, there was no conduit to get these sort of, this information out. So anyway, to get to the point, we got the coach, drove to South Cerney, You know, and it was a company group, so it was, you know, as we know, it was us. It was all the attachment support company, signals, etc. We drove to the Air Mountain Centre in South Cerney. I think it was Kenya they were telling us we were going to, hence the reason the jungle kit was issued. We got to South Cerney. I do believe it's South Cerney, and we were put in the big hangar there. Anyone's been at South Cerney knows that hangar, you know, the big briefing hangar. And as the last man walked in to get a brief, the doors were closed. We all had our notebooks out, and you know, the intelligence services there told us, put your notebooks away because what we're about to tell you might cost the lives of British servicemen. And that's when they went into the West Side Boys. That's, of course, we knew that you know, the Royal Irish members of the Royal Irish were taken prisoner, because as Tim said, it was on the news that the world knew about it, but we didn't know at the time that we were going to be part of the rescue operation. And we all looked at each other and thought, shit, you know, this is serious. And that's when the you know, the J2 delivery intelligence started getting delivered to us. We were briefed on the situation and what was going on. And then we were there for a number of days doing a bit of pre-training. They were conscious that the world's media might get wind of this, so we were sort of carrying out, you know, pre-deployment training for 3 or 4 days in and around South Cerney. Just your normal stuff, you know, weapon handling tests, a bit of navigation, you know, just catching up on the drills, because we're all trained in the British Army to, you know, for these sort of situations.
And you've already just come back from
the
jungle.
We've just come back from the jungle, so they knew this. But if there is such a jungle in Jamaica, but it's close enough.
Yeah.
But in their eyes, we'd had the training for that to sort of be relatively successful on the mission. So we carried out some more pre-deployment training behind, you know, out of sight of you know, if any sort of media outlets could sort of film us and that. And then we walked, you know, we walked into one of the hangars down there, and there was a mountain worth of ammunition. You know, we sort of we bombed up before we went. You know, 10 magazines, bandolier, L2 grenades. I think the only special thing they gave us was 66mm rocket launchers. Remember, this was the days before underslung grenade launchers. This was the days before personal well radios, sharpshooter rifles, light machine guns. We didn't have that. It was SE-80A1s and it was GPMGs. I think there was 6 Browning pistols in a battalion in a company armory, you know, for the officers in them days. So it was basic, but that's all we knew. You know, we didn't know there was other kit available out there, and that's what we trained with.
Well, the late 90s, early 2000s, historically,
exactly.
It was underfunded, the British Army, because there wasn't a lot. It wasn't until the later conflicts where a bit more money was injected, was it?
Yeah, exactly. And then before we knew it, we'd deployed. We knew there was a special force elements were out in British special forces elements were out in Sierra Leone. We were going out there to meet them, potentially train with them. But until we got there, we didn't know to what extent we were going to be involved in the mission. I think right up until the last moment, we weren't. We were just a contingency part of the operation. You know, we were training alongside, you know, the SF units out there, just so we were ready to sort of support them. And the decision was made that they needed that support because, you know, as we know, there was Magbenny Village, which is what the parachute regiment went into, opposite the opposite side of the Rockhole Creek River, and then you had Jerry Barner, which is where the obviously the hostages were. So it was decided it was quite a large target. There was quite a large amount, as Tim alluded to, of West Side boys in the area. So, you know, it was decided that we had to go in with them. So, but that's leaping ahead. We were at South Cerney, finished our pre-deployment training. We bombed up. You know, we sort of mags were full, bandoliers were issued, grenades were given out, and 66s were given to people. We trained on all of that, and after a number of days, we drove to Bryce Norton to get onto one of the days of the Tri-Stars before voyages, and there was screening put up to sort of, you know, shield us going onto the aircraft. When I say screening, it was just fences with some Hessian pipes, so the media couldn't sort of see us getting on there. If word had got out that we were flying out there to support the operation, weirdly we got on the Tri-Star, and you know, we've all travelled before where they take lighters and razors off you now, but you know, when these must, they sort of lift the rules, and I was actually putting my webbing in the overhead bins full of live ammunition and 66mm rocket launchers under your seats, you know, so it can be done when you have to. And we flew out. we flew out. We went via Dakar for a quick stop. We jumped onto a C-130 then, and we then forward mounted to Freetown. It was quite dark when we got to Freetown. It was a long old flight, in 2 legs. Again, it was a company group. When we got to Freetown, we were shipped onto the back of 4-tonners, and the 4-tonner screens at the back were put down, so we couldn't really see where we were. Not so much so we couldn't see out, so people couldn't see in. And we started the 2 or 3 hour drive to the forward mountain location within the jungle to start training before we flew in for the operation. So there's some context in the build-up from us to getting out. But to answer your question, we weren't aware. We knew something had happened. OPSEC was good for a number of reasons. Technology and the fact we didn't know what was going on, and we didn't really find out or get wind that we were supporting the operation until we got to South Cerney, the Air Mountain Centre.
So obviously you're prepping, you're getting ready, it's stuff starting to get real.
Yeah.
Join us after the break and we'll talk about the mission itself. I want to tell you about our new sponsors, Veterans for Veterans. If you served after 1987 and your hearing's taken a knock from your time in the forces, these are the people to speak to. They've helped thousands of veterans like us claim compensation for tinnitus and hearing loss. They're ex-military themselves, so they genuinely get it.
It's free to check if you qualify, and the claims are no win, no fee. To get started, click the link in this video or visit veteransforveterans.co.uk.
Welcome back. So in part 1, we covered the operation and how it came about and the initial actions. And in part 2, we're going to be covering the mission and the aftermath.
By the Friday, it was then presented to Cobra that we pretty much have an end to this situation. There's 1 or 2 likelihoods that the indications we're getting was that they were getting ready to move. So the question was hanging in the air, so are they bringing the hostages with them? Are the hostages even still alive? On the Friday morning when the briefing at Cobra went on, Tony Blair wasn't there, Jeff Hoon was, and the plan was presented as to what would happen if it was approved in government. And at that stage, they were very much still sucking their teeth about, are we making a bad situation worse, And so what had happened was then, there was like a breakout session. I went to the loo, and funny enough, standing 2 pissers away from me was Jeff Hoon having a piss. And as he finished, he was washing his hands, and I was standing there, and he said to me, well, what do you think about it? And I said, well, there's no certainty that the hostages are still alive, and the indications that they're going to move is that they're not alive anymore. And he said, well, on that basis, is it worth the effort that we mount an operation for something that we can't rescue anymore? And I said, well, there's 2 things in that. First of all, if there's any hope, we've got to mount an operation to rescue them. And the second thing is, even if they're not alive, we need to send them a fucking message. And he's like, okay. And we went in and said, let's do it.
No, fair play. So for you, Ian, obviously you're seeing it from the inside point of view, like things are deteriorating, what sort of, for you, I take it you had hope that there was going to be a rescue mission. Did you have any sort of information about the things that were going to unfold, or was it just a case of hoping for the best and hoping that someone was going to come and rescue you?
At my level, it was just hoping. I think it's been well discussed. It was decided by the OC, I'm not sure who else knew, not to tell us in case our mood changed, which it would have. So the atmospherics would have changed with us. Would that have alerted the West Side boys? I don't know. But definitely I had no idea that on that day, the specific, you're hoping for a rescue. But, I mean, if I can jump to the rescue itself, when I heard the helicopters that morning, I think most of us were terrified because we'd established round about day one of the demands. The first demands was no helicopters over sort of McBenney or Barrybana, or we kill the hostages. So it was instant panic. in my mind, it was about, so we heard them turn away, which is obviously when the guys that were already on the ground had said, you know, they'd radioed through and said, "You're too close, we can hear you." In my mind, about 30 seconds later, the world erupted. It can't have been, because it takes a few minutes, and you know, Gary, you'll tell me better how long it actually takes to fly up the Rockhill Creek. It's maybe about 7 minutes, but in my mind it was about 30 seconds. So sort of maybe what we've talked about, maybe the West Side boys were a bit slow reacting, but genuinely no idea that it was a rescue. I thought it was a UN helicopter coming to get a bit of revenge for the attack on the Nigerians. I didn't know it was a rescue until the SAS guy turned up at the door.
Which we'll come on to that,
Yes.
that point. So from your side, Gary, obviously, kind of you've mounted up, you're ready to roll.
Yeah.
Shit's got real. Okay. So initial sort of actions from your kind of perspective.
Yeah, so where did I get? We're now in the camp. We're now in the forward mountain base. Let's call it that, in the actual jungle itself. When we were a flight distance away from Jerry Barney village itself, obviously for tactical reasons, and we spent a few days training, as alluded to. Funny enough, we speak about hostages being released. Two or three of them came our way, and they actually helped us by giving us some. Real life, positioning of, where yous were kept, what Magbenny village looked like, because you'd been there before you went across the Rockhill Creek to where you're being held. And it allowed us to sort of mind tape areas out and then just enhance the training sort of thing. So it was quite good. The way the intelligence was sort of fed to us from the use of hostages was good, because it allowed us to build up, a more realistic perspective of what the villages looked like. Onto the, and we spent, we were there for a few days, zeroing weapon systems. It's then we started working with, the SF lads who were obviously there already. We were doing a sort of, we were working together, how we support them, how they'd support us, how we support each other, what the attack would look like potentially, and the options. But like I alluded to earlier, we were there on hold as a contingency just in case needed. So we're just going through that build-up training on the ground with them, just waiting for the shout really. So we were prepared to go. Literally the night before the attack itself, we were told, we were stood up, we were going in. The decision was made to send us because it was, like I say, two separate villages with the Rockhill Creek. Obviously, separating them both. There was I think we were there. We were sent in to sort of our primary mission was to seize and hold Magbenny village itself. Because that could have, if we didn't do that, obviously hinder the rescue. Obviously the SA lads, the SAS squadron were trying to do north in with yourselves in Jerry Barney village. So it was a joint attack, a joint mission, a joint rescue mission. Us, A Company, the 1st Battalion Parachute Regiment, focusing on Magbenny village, and obviously the SAS guys doing the rescue on Jerry Barney itself, north of the Rockhill Creek, simultaneous at the same time. In support of the squadron who was doing that. Funnily enough, okay, let's go to the morning of the attack. We were ready, we were prepped. We'd finished our battle prep. Magazines were bombed up. We had our live scales. Equipment was checked, and we managed to get a few hours sleep before we sort of woke up early hours of the morning of the Sunday. I do believe we went in to do the rescue itself. We woke up to Ride of the Valkyries blaring out from the D Squadron sort of tents on site itself in the forward mountain base itself, and us the parachute regiment guys burst out laughing like this is quite early, as they say. You've got Ride of the Valkyries blaring as we're doing battle prep, camming up, and putting cam cream on and do final preparations or checks of your equipment before you go. It was then quite a quiet walk down to the landing zone, the HLS, which was down the bottom end of the forward mountain base we were in, on the outskirts of the jungle. And us and the D Squadron lads sort of walked down. And we knew a lot of people, traditionally, a lot of the parachute regiment, a lot of the the SES guys came from the parachute regiment anyway. You know, the percentages are quite big, particularly in D Squadron at the time. So we had a lot of friends in the squadron, which was easy because you know, we could work together quite easily because we knew each other at that sort of level. We walked down, and the Chinooks were sort of sat there, and we went in 2 waves. The first wave was 2 Chinooks going. I think they were cross-loaded with the D Squadron guys and the parachute regiment guys, and they set off, and you know, it's still early hours. It was the plan was to do a dawn attack, literally as the sun was sort of rising, and the first wave went in, and you know, I imagine they followed the same, you know, flight sort of route we did, which was drop into the Waco Creek River. Literally, you know, you're skimming the river on the Chinooks, you know, literally 10, 20, 30 feet above it, and then you sort of bank out last moment, and two Chinooks sort of flew over towards the relevant targets, and it wasn't long. You know, it seemed like a lifetime, but it wasn't. It was literally only 20, 30 minutes before the Chinooks were back to pick us up the second wave. And we were picked up, and obviously we followed the flame. I do imagine the same sort of route in, and it was quite surreal, really. Just, you know, no seats in the Chinooks. They were obviously loaded for, you know, long range sort of operations, internal fuel tanks, and sort of, you know, armoured line floors. All the windows were punched out the Chinooks, so, you know, it was a weapons platform. Us being the weapons inside, firing out the windows if we had to. And each Chinook had, you know, port and starboard miniguns mounted, and as we sort of, you know, dropped into the river itself, the sun was just coming up, really, and they banked out, and the miniguns started firing. And Tim alluded to the fact that they were trying to. There was 2 other Lynx helicopters with 50 cal chain guns mounted, and the idea was to sort of neutralise the Wimick with the 50 cal, the British Wimick Land Rover with a 50 cal machine gun, and the sort of a flatbed pickup, this flatbed truck with an anti-aircraft weapon system, which were in Magbenny village itself, and the Lynx helicopters just engaged before we went in with 50 cal chain guns.
I think there might have been 2 flatbeds with what we call 23 twos,
yeah,
which are Russian anti-aircraft guns,
yeah,
which would have chopped the helicopters to pieces.
Yeah, but to link in with that, I just remember, you know, we were loaded up, we were stood up in the air in the Chinook itself. I just remember looking out the windows, and there was just chaos. There was just tracer rounds going everywhere. These air platforms, our Lynxes and the miniguns from the port and starboard of the Chinooks itself were just on fire, really, just neutralising targets everywhere, you know. And it was that's when the reality hit, you know, because it's all right training for these things. It's all right, you know, getting close to forward mountain bases and training with some real life intelligence which has come from the village itself, the hostages, and whatever intelligence sort of platforms were linking in to give us as much information as we could get. But it doesn't really become reality until you're flying in and seeing what resources, what sort of firepower is being made available to get you on target as safely as it can. But it's not war. It's a deliberately planned operation. You know, the idea is to get us there as safe as we can, to have, you know, to concentrate those assets, those fire support assets, those resources, to have maximum effect, which we did. So we then pulled out the Waco Creek. Obviously, rounds going everywhere from the support, the attack helicopters with the Lynxes, and the support helicopters, which were rear in Chinooks, port and starboard miniguns firing. And then we flew towards the actual target itself. Flight time was, like you say, from dropping into the Waco Creek was between 7 and 10 minutes. You know, we were literally, you know, low level flying before we pulled out to just pop above the canopy, the tree line, to drop into the village itself. Second wave, like I said, the first wave we'd found out had been dropped into a swamp. When I say swamp, it was sort of marshlands. It looked, initially I thought, how the hell did that happen? But when daylight came and we finished the attack, we were doing the clearance patrols, which I'll get to in a second. You sort of look at that landing site, that HLS, which was selected, and you would think it was firm ground. So the Chinooks initially sort of landed on target and lowered the ramps, tried to do a full-on land, but the pilots must have realised it wasn't firm. So the guys had to jump out into it, and they were up to their waist in water. This is the first wave of parachute regiment guys in Magbenny village itself. And luckily, the West Side boys hadn't managed to concentrate a force yet, you know, to sort of repel the attack.
Well, that was like what you said, Tim. Obviously, the pre-op there, which was we were chatting about a minute ago, was like you said about obviously some booze was sent in beforehand to kind of. Obviously, that worked because all the West Side boys were pissed. Did you see this as like? Did you see them getting pissed on the morning, if you can remember, or?
No, that they would have been pissed the night before,
regardless.
But they always were.
Right, okay.
I think what that trick did was just up the ante for them. It just made sure it was the chances were they were going to be hungover and dying.
The thing
anyway.
is, the lorry went in on the road, so it's a question of the West Side boys in the south of the river share with the West Side boys of the north of the river. But there was a stack of booze, and they got stuck into it con gusto, and on the Saturday night, and that was the plan. That then there'd be a bit of a outbreak party in the following morning.
Well, it obviously had the desired effect, so they were underprepared.
Yeah, I think it worked. I mean, they took their time to concentrate their troops. There's a lot of them there, both sides. Joey Barney and Magbenny Village. Joey Barney and Magbenny Village. There was a lot of West Side boys there. Let's be honest. There was quite a lot of them, or we were sort of initially led to believe there was. And when we actually went on to the attack itself, they were there. But I'll go into the details in a second when they sort of, withdrew out the village. We went across the football pitch. They adopted 5 positions, a tree line, muzzle flash, all that sort of stuff. We'll go into it. But initially, I think the first wave was quite lucky because they didn't have time to get their shit in order, for want of a better phrase. Which allowed the first wave guys to sort of push through that marshland up to their waist, sort of with minimal, they were uncontested to a certain extent.
Which is very lucky.
Yeah, which was very lucky. I think there was, you can't hide a Chinook and, the big beast, as we know, and loud. So we lost the element of surprise once those things go on to target. The lynxes might have got on, and they're firing pretty rapid, those 50 cal chain guns, so they'll have the effect. Once the Chinook comes on, a support helicopter laden full of troops, parachute regiment and SAS, you've lost element of surprise. So it's gone noises, we know, for want of a better phrase. Yeah. But yeah, there was minimal contestment for that. From what I wasn't on the first wave, but from what I've been led to believe and what I've been told, there was minimal contestment. They got to the firm bank, and I was on the second wave, so they'd learned from the mistakes, and we were directed, or somebody sort of marshalled the aircraft. The pilots themselves, because the same pilots came back to pick us up. Managed to sort of how they'd done that, flying wise. You could tell they're good at what they do. How they got us, into a position where we weren't dropped into the swamp. We were dropped onto some firm sort of land. But I remember thinking, flying in, these blades are close to these trees. They were clipping the canopy, or what you were saying, Ian. They were, what you've been told, they were actually these rotor blades were hitting the canopy. They were that close to get us on. But we got on safely. The end state is we got all of. It wasn't the company group that went on. It was just a company group's quite a large beast. There's only so much space in 2 waves of support helicopters, two Chinooks doing 2 runs. Obviously, the priority goes to the SF guys who are doing the actual rescue itself in Jerebarna. But also we had to get a force of some type on the ground as well. So a decision was made that the night before to send in the 3 rifle platoons, a couple of barrel, I think, of 8mm mortar. So we had some of our mortar guys there. It might have been 1 barrel, 2 barrels. I do forget, but there was mortars were there. And some other assets really, but that was it. I mean, most of the company group there just wasn't room on the aircraft. We would love to have taken everyone, but we couldn't. So they sent in the guys who they prioritised to send in. So we're on the ground. We've at that stage, how we done it, we don't know. There was obviously an element of luck in there, but there's an element of good tactical planning as well. Good skills from the pilots and the planning teams to sort of get us there and set us up for success, really, because their job is to get us there. And neutralise those assets to achieve that. The end state is we're on the ground. The A company group reduced, what I've alluded to, was delivered successfully, and we're ready to start clearing through Magbenny Village.
So you talked about sort of, obviously this was simultaneous with the kind of SF going in and kind of rescuing you guys. So you talk of choppers coming in, which obviously alarmed everybody because of what the information you said. So your first reaction, 2-2 guy stood at the door. Talk us through that.
Yeah, it was a weird one. We didn't know it was a rescue. Like the OC did, we didn't. I've spoken about this with people before. My memory is absolutely, it's just gone on this. So, as I said, it felt like about 30 seconds from me waking up with the chopper and panicking to the guy being at the door. It's not. It's, as we've talked about, it's about a 7-minute flight. And a lot of the other hostages have talked about trying to barricade the door to stop the West Side Boys getting to us before the choppers. I still hadn't realised. What I found out recently was the reason that West Side Boys couldn't get in to get at us was they lost the key to the padlock.
Well, look again, fate and luck, it plays a part.
Yeah, but apparently, and I can't remember any of it, we'd spent a fair bit of time trying to barricade that door. We sort of mentioned the guys in the jungle had radioed back and said, "You're too noisy." And as Tim said, we went to an IA drill then. And they've talked about how they basically kicked off to cover the fight while the choppers were coming in. I can't remember hearing any of that. But by all accounts, they were in a pretty tight fight for that sort of 7 minutes while the choppers came in.
Yeah.
My first memory is just hearing that it must have been the Chinook chain gun opening up, just coming over the top, and the world exploded. And yeah, like I've said 1,000 times before, the SAS guy turned up at the door. We were shouting British Army. I think he must have just kicked it in, because the lock was solid, but the padlock was solid. The actual bit it was bolted to was a load of nonsense. And just absolutely chilled out. I can't remember exactly what he said. It really was something like, "Morning, guys, he's all good." And then he says, "Look, keep the head down, be back in a minute." And off he went about his business. It was surreal. But then it got a wee bit real after that. There was rounds I remember coming through the shutters on the windows. So I was digging in. You can't dig in, it's concrete, but I could not have got lower to the ground. And the world was just erupting. And I'm not even sure how long it was, if it was 5 minutes or 20 minutes while the fight went on.
But you've had so many days under duress as well, You've got to take into account that aspect, and then suddenly it's just gone from quiet to like all hell is ripping loose, and you're not going to remember or take into account as such.
Yeah, look, it was an emotional roller coaster, because I've said sort of when I heard the helicopter, I was certain it was the UN coming back to get a bit of revenge for the attack on the Nigerians. I think it was 2 days before. And I thought, if that's the UN coming in to fight the West Side Boys with us in the middle, we're dead. So it wasn't until sort of he arrived at the door. And then it's an absolute emotional switch. I remember we eventually, before we got evacuated, we got moved to like a holding area, like another building closer to the HLS, and that's when they brought Musa. Musa couldn't walk. He'd been that badly tortured, so we had to carry him. And we got into this holding area, and Musa was in pieces. He said, "The West Side Boys are counter-attacking. We're going to die." And I just remember, I've never been more confident that someone was wrong in my life. I said to Musa, "No, they're not." Obviously, by this stage, we'd clocked the 203s, and we knew it was Hereford that was coming in. From that absolute terror, I don't think I've ever been more confident of anything in my life that we were getting out of there, which was maybe a wee bit misplaced at the time, but it was just where your mind goes.
And So you were led by SF from one building to another. Do you recall that part? Or
I remember a couple of things. I remember, so there was 4 of them, sort of one front and back and one either side, and we were running up. I remember I could hear the fighting in off to the right, so that the SAS guys were kind of pushing into the jungle and trying to push them back, but it was still a big fight. I think I can tell this story because I told it to the SAS guys when I met them recently. I remember someone shouting at a couple of boys for a shit fire position.
right.
And one of those weird things that stuck with me for the rest of my career. Because you know when you just want to mong it, and you're cold and wet, I couldn't ever do it. Anytime I just wanted to mong it and get a really crap fire position that was comfy, I thought, no, if it's good enough on Barras, it'll do me. So it was it's just funny what sticks in your mind. But yeah, they let us up. They'd brought Musa to us. He got a few steps and then collapsed because I think he'd had his feet tied together for so long they just weren't working. But again, we carried him. We got into this building, similar to where we'd been held, and just a holding area. And again, just that what we talked about, sort of off air, that calmness. There was a guy sort of at this stage stationed outside the door, just sort of staggering on, and again, it was like he was out for a Sunday stroll, just chilled out. I do remember, I'll probably use your podcast to apologise to him because he gave me his water bottle and then I disappeared off in the chopper with his water.
I'm sure he forgives you.
I don't know, mate. I've definitely heard about 4 years later. I think I didn't meet him again, but someone that knew him and says he's looking his water bottle back. But, just that calmness. And so we were held there, and then it was like wanting to jump too far ahead. The next step for us was up to the chopper to sort of get out of there. But by that stage, it had been to pick up. I think it had already dropped off the SAS casualties. It had come back and it had the para casualties. So we were sort of loaded on with them.
Right.
For the trip back. I guess 45 minutes after it all started, we were up and away.
So reality set in. You're on a chopper. You're out there. You kind of reality's now set in. We've been rescued, so to speak. From your aspect, Tim, was this obviously being fed back as real time as it could be back then?
I'd actually left the organisation I'd handed over on the Friday night, so it was being obviously relayed. The focus was very much in country, and I think back in the UK at our permanent joint headquarters, they were watching it closely, and when it was clear that the hostages were safe and were there and safe, and 18 African hostages didn't even know about had been rescued as well. It went from nail biting to euphoria, and it just so happened that the chief of the defence staff, then later Field Marshal Guthrie, was doing the David Frost show. So he turned up and was able to announce to the nation on air that this had happened on the David Frost show. Just happened to be good timing for that. But I think there was a huge euphoria that the hostages had been rescued because there'd been a significant doubt that they would be safe before that. And of course, like any operation, things can go wrong. So it's always a relief when something is successful.
Yeah. So obviously a successful end to it.
Successful-ish, because there was eggs broken along the way.
Yeah, of course. But going back a little bit, which part, when you got on the ground, did you notice the real resistance? Obviously, the rebels have kind of, militia have woke up, they've got the shit together, so to speak. Yeah. When you started thinking, right, we've got a fight on our hands now.
Yeah. It didn't really take them long. I mean, I think they probably, I'd say, made a mistake. They allowed us to get, the company group, onto the target location with minimal resistance. So we were there. I I quickly realised, and I'll get to answer your question in a second, that we were quite channelled initially. You know, we were down. You walked it a few weeks ago, didn't you? You remember that the single track with bridges left and right of you. So we were channelled initially. You know, we obviously tried to sort of separate our platoons the best we could, and we could. You know, you'd send a platoon around to the flanks, and we've always taught. You know, it's no secret. You know. Fire maneuver, whether that be a platoon as fire support, a platoon moving, a platoon in reserve, you know, or a section as fire support and a section assaulting and a section reserve. It's how general, you know, modern military sort of do things. So we always try to maintain that as well. So anyway, to get to the point, it was probably once we started moving down that track, which opens up into so we're sort of off site. You know, the buildings weren't in sight. I'd say they were probably about 100 metres away, 200 metres away down this track, if my memory sort of is getting it right. And then I remember moving down that track, and it's the first person I saw was a West Side boy staggering out his house, sort of bootlaces undone, you know, barely able to hold his rifle. So that told me that they still didn't really... even though we were on the move now, we were starting to sort of position ourselves, you know, assault suppress reserve wise to be successful. It was only then they started to react, but it was too late. We were in a position. It wasn't long after that, you know, the fire support started going in. We started assaulting those first load of buildings with another platoon, and then, you know yourself, they become fire support. Reserve platoon have come round. You know, like we've all been sort of like you know, any modern Western world sort of or capable army knows that's how you do things. So yeah, I'd say it probably took 10 to 15 minutes of us, the last Chinook leaving. I'd say within 10 minutes we were into the fight. It didn't, however, then take them long once they realised that we were there and we were starting to assault the initial outer buildings of Magbeni village itself, because you start from the outside and you start to move in. It didn't take them long, and then before you know it, we were getting a lot of incoming fire from various locations within the sort of the village itself, and then it's a matter of, you know, identifying, locating the enemy positions, the West Side boys' positions, giving good target indications so the next platoon can take over, and then and the same. We systematically cleared through the buildings, and I'd say it was quite early on. We heard the explosion, you know, which we'll probably get to in a second, and whether it be a 51mm drop shot or whatever, you know, our OC's TAC was hit. Just as he was calling in, you know, a platoon commander sort of from one of the platoons to sort of talk about the next phase of the operation, you know, like they do. The OC's TAC was hit, and unfortunately the OC was injured. One of the platoon commanders was hurt, radio operator was hurt, and I was involved as a lance corporal. Then I was in A company, one section, you know, obviously one platoon. So I was on the left flank clearing one of the buildings. I just finished clearing the buildings. I was about to go into a fire support role, and I heard the explosion. And that's the first time I sort of, it's like I said, we train for these things, but it doesn't become real until you're actually flying in and seeing the effect on the ground. You know, yes, we'd been to Northern Ireland. Yes, we'd been to Kosovo. But at the time, personally, I'd never really, you know, physically fought against an enemy I could see. Yeah,
well, this is really the first major since probably the Falklands. Because obviously Northern Ireland, there was aspects and skirmishes, but this proper sort of two-way range kind of stuff on that level since the Falklands, really, isn't it? Yeah,
and it sort of gets real. And to add to that, you know, it's the first time I'd really, you know, once the explosion. Once whatever went off, and the OC was hurt, and a number of his TAC was hurt, it's the first time I'd actually heard a man scream as well, which is, I mean, I'm not being sexist at all, but you hear women scream all the time. You know, you hear a man screaming in pain. It sort of hammers at home, and I froze personally for what seemed like, you know, a few seconds, but it was a fraction of a second. The section commander grabbed me. I was just to IC. He went, "You okay?" I went, "Yeah, I'm okay." You know, because when we were dropped off, the Chinooks didn't just disappear. They circled. We could see them circling above us, and they were waiting for casualties. They were waiting for for hostage extraction. They were there. They hadn't finished their job. They were there as the Lynx helicopters were there with the 50 cal chain guns as air support, used as attack helicopters, and the Chinook helicopters were just in a circular pattern around the villages, ready to extract the hostages and extract any casualties. We had casualties. Obviously the squadron, D squadron across the river in Joey Barner had casualties and injuries, and so yeah, as Ian alluded to earlier, honestly they impressed me so much. We were on the ground involved in the fight. As soon as the explosion happened, we stabilised the casualties. Red smoke was thrown. We planned this. If the helicopter see red smoke, it's their cue to come in. We'd expect them to, not to come in if it was a hot HLS, as we call it. There's rounds going everywhere still, and the fight's still happening. But they came in. There was still rounds going everywhere, and those Chinook, those one of the Chinooks at least, I think both make them eventually, but I've definitely seen one land ready to extract the casualties. And as they extract those casualties, I think they flew across then to your side to take up the hostage, to take Ian and the guys who were rescued. As they came in, funny enough, but a funny story, the downdraft, remember I told you to the left flank of the village?
Yeah.
The downdraft was by the buildings, lifted off one of the wriggly tin, because the buildings, the roofs were made of like wriggly tin.
Yeah.
And the downdraft just lifted one off, and it seemed like slow motion. And I thought, shit, this is going to hit me. I couldn't get away from it, and it just landed straight on top of me and two other guys. And we were just trapped underneath it. We couldn't move by our power helmets. And just remember the section commander at the time, he came across, Mong strength, lifted the roof up. We all scurried out like rats to sort of carry on. But yeah, my point is those pilots they had some balls, and they flew in and extracted this casualty before moving across to yourselves.
Imagine how much shit you'd have got though if you'd have been severely injured by a rooftop and not enemy fire.
Exactly,
You'd have got some shit from
yeah,
that.
yeah.
That's a career's worth of being hammered for that.
Yeah, I'm glad they sort of got me out of it. But and that was the start of the assault really. So within 5 to 10 minutes we were receiving fire. It wasn't mass amounts initially. It wasn't. I mean it was a fight. We were sort of going from building to building to building. But then eventually what happened is you were talking about moving across, revisiting the football pitch on your tour, on your trip a few weeks ago. The West Side boys eventually, because we were clearing the building and then we couldn't, either kill, capture, whatever, we had to do, moved towards the back end of that football pitch into the tree line. And they sort of regathered themselves there, the West Side boys, and that's where they felt safe because they're in the trees now. And the reason I say it is I just remember when I was suppressed platoon again, so we're providing fire support. I remember being stood beside one of the buildings, and remember you were talking about moments that stick with you. This is one of my moments. A Lynx helicopter with a 50 cal chain gun above me was firing. All you're doing then is firing at muzzle flashes. If you can't identify the enemy, you fire at the muzzle flashes, as we all know. And I was in the corner of this building firing at muzzle flashes. A Lynx helicopter was firing its chain gun at muzzle flash of the tree, ripping down trees. And the brass was just raining down on me. And I just remember looking across, and you think, all I was thinking is, one of those hot cases, please don't go down the back of my smog, because we all know how much that hurts. But it was one of those moments where you think that it's real anyway, but it's more real now because they'd regathered themselves. They're now feeling a bit brave and they're trying to sort of fight back. But by then it was too late. When you've got two Lynxes with 50 cal chain guns, you've now got a company group worth of soldiers on the ground, paratroopers on the ground, employing sort of the tactics they know to clear the buildings. We just overwhelmed them. It was then that we sort of then... The only thing we had left to clear was the Wimmick you spoke about with the 50 cal. That was on... I do believe on the far side you had the football pitch with some buildings on the left-hand side as you're looking towards the tree line. I think that was by the river, by the Rocco Creek River. And the Wimmick, I remember the Wimmick being parked there. And even then I thought, why aren't they using that, against us? But it now turns to light that it'd been, by your guys, it had been sort of taken out of action before we sort of got on the ground.
So a good move back then.
Yeah, because that would have caused...
With hindsight, without even knowing it.
That would have caused some damage, or been quite hard to sort of neutralise. But then we just systematically cleared across into the tree line. It was then you sort of knew that we'd we'd gained the momentum, we continued the momentum. There was no natural pauses. Even when we received the casualties and the Chinook came in to extract the casualties, we still continued the fight like you do, and you just utilise that momentum you've got, and then we pushed towards that sort of back tree line, and then it's just a bit of sporadic fire really, while the West Side boys just retreated to the next villages, and I do believe the ones which were still alive, and that was sort of the end of it. It was finished before it started. Like you said, within 45 minutes to an hour, these guys were sort of lifted off target. We then went into our sort of reorg phase. We sort of carried out clearance patrols within the jungle. I told you a story about that.
But you said you find kit. This is what they kind of did, wasn't it? Because obviously there's no uniform. No. So they ditched kit. The ones that got away, ditched kit, and then just blended in with villagers and stuff like that. Yeah,
one thing I noticed is you'll correct me if I'm right, Ian, is we'd noticed they were wearing British uniform. They were wearing our ECBA. They must have took the ECBA and webbing and stuff off you, and they put it on because it has protection. And it was sort of evident, not that it had done them much good when we were sort of, carrying out the assault in the village. You're getting 50 cal chain gun rounds in you, and obviously the miniguns are firing, and we're carrying out the assault in a controlled, professional manner, like we're trained to do. It didn't do much use to them. The end state was they were still. We had the desired effect on them, but when we were carrying out the clearance patrols, I'd just come back from a jungle trackers course in Brunei, and I was with one of the LOs, without giving too much away name wise, on our site, and I just we were clearing to the left as I look at it, so away from the river, so we were parallel in the river, and we were doing a clearance patrol, and I said, somebody's been down there. And everyone's like, what do you know? Somebody's been down there. I said, tell me now, somebody has been down there. I could see, they call it sign, obviously. I could see some sign. And we got permission eventually to pursue the sign just for a few hundred meters. We didn't want to go outside our area of operation, or AO. We'd already gone to our limit of exploitation, so we pushed beyond it. And I've now got a cover man over me. I'm now concentrating on the sign. So I'm following inconclusive sign, pointers here, little scuffs there. You can see a little bit of ground disturbance. And then I hit a footprint, and it was conclusive sign, as they call it. And they're like, you know what you're doing? I went, I've told you, I've just done the course. So we followed it, and then I found a set of discarded webbing, British webbing. I found a set of discarded body armour, British body armour, and there was blood which went over a sort of a tree which just fell across the path I was sort of following. So whoever it was, West Side Boy had been hit and was on the run and was just throwing kit off as he was going. We didn't go far enough to find the person, but it was evident he'd been hit when he was running. So and that's what we'd done. We got as much kit back, British kit back, as we could before the Chinooks, before the Wimics and that got underslung. Because afterwards, when we finished, the Chinooks came back in and they underslung they pulled out the British equipment, the Wimics and the FFRs and things like that. And we just threw all the stuff we could in the back of these vehicles for it to get extracted. So yeah, that's
So that's bringing the kind of operation itself to a close.
Yeah.
Now the aftermath and the immediate kind of aftermath, if you like. Now, obviously, you've been recently back to Sierra Leone for a documentary for Veterans. How was that, and how did that help you with your recovery? Because you've been honest and open about, it's obviously what you went through. Back then in 2000 is going to cause you issues moving forward. But how has that helped you kind of moving forward, and describe how that came about and how it was over there?
Yeah, so look, the trip was brilliant. How it came about, I think it was the British High Commissioner that sort of had an idea to do it for the 25th anniversary. SAS guys have been contacted, a lot of them were due to go, some of the para guys were due to go, and I suppose by chance there was an ex-Royal Irish guy out there doing security officer for the embassy or for the High Commission, and had said, look, we need some of the hostages out here as well.
Absolutely.
So I speak to him a lot, and he got in touch with me, and long story short, we managed to organise a couple of us to go out, so myself and the RSO. I'll give the standard chuck up here to Veterans for Veterans, who sponsored me to go and paid it. But yeah, really good trip. In terms of like the impact, I've spoke before about sort of mental health and stuff, which I know you're into. I've always said that any issues I had, coming back from Ukraine and stuff, I'm not sure they were Sierra Leone related. I think I told this story so much to so many people after, just because everyone wants to know. It's like unofficial therapy that you don't realise is happening. And I never, I think just telling that story 1,000 different times in the pub, doing presentations in the army might have helped. So, I never said any issues I had. I never directly put them down to Sierra Leone. The flip side of that is going over there. For good or for bad, when the rescue was over, we were kept separate from everyone, the paras and the SF guys, possibly because Brad had been killed, and it might not have been a good mix. On the beers, we're obviously all ecstatic. They probably had a bit of disappointment. So like one of the big there's probably two big things I take from Sierra Leone. One was I'd had 25 years of, are we to blame for Brad? Because we were the ones that messed up and went down that track. We'd been told not to, and we got caught. And it's not like, if you go into Afghan or somewhere, you're going in to sort of do your job, but you're not doing it because of a British Army mistake. You're doing it because of that's the job. That's what we do. But Brad was killed because of our mistake. So it was good to talk to them, talk to all the SF guys and get that. I don't want to say out of my system. Get a bit of closure on that, because as all of them told me. Well, firstly, we were able to do a memorial service for him and the two guys killed in Kenya. And it was brilliant to see the Sierra Leoneans have a monument, like a memorial to him. So we were able to lay wreaths. Just off on a tangent, their plan now, led by Musa and the Sierra Leone Army, is they're going to fence off the old White House where we were held, which is still a ruin, the pit where Musa was held, and the memorial. And they're going to get plaques on it, and it's going to become a permanent memorial. But to be able to do that memorial service and to be able to sort of talk to the SF guys, who all said if Brad came back today, he'd be straight back on the chopper, and things like that. That for me, that was the main takeaway if we're talking sort of Sierra Leone specific and mental health. And the other thing was the absolute impact. We talk about Barras changed Sierra Leone, but until you're actually out there and see it, it's like an absolute defining event that they all still remember. I think they said about 3 months later, the RUF and the West Side Boys were done. And it's been a pretty steady country ever since. As again we talked about earlier, I spent the day in an Irish bar drinking Guinness. It's a different place, but to see the impact and to see how well it's remembered, and sort of, it's hard to explain, but to know that it was more than just a rescue of 6 of us. Although I was glad of that. That changed the country round.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
It put, as sort of Tim said, even if we had been dead, we need to put a message out. I don't know if they were anticipating at the time how big that message was actually going to be when they did it. But it just resonated through the country. It resonated through the Sierra Leone Army. It resonated through the UN. Stop embarrassing yourselves. Get up country and sort it out.
Well, this was actually something which was discussed at Cobra, is that we couldn't afford to be defeated on this occasion, because all the work that had been done to rescue Sierra Leone and train the army and putting money in and rescuing the entire United Nations force. If we lost on this one, it was a signal to anybody: you can pick up a gun and go and help yourself. And I think it was the at first light on that morning was the day and hour when Sierra Leone turned a corner, and it stopped being the 44th of the 44 basket cases of the United Nations. Nations that became a nation with a hope and a future for itself. And indeed today, Sierra Leone is disputed territory, and that it remains important to the West. It remains important to the United Kingdom as the Gibraltar of. But the Chinese are moving in, and others, and Sierra Leoneans don't want that. They look to the British and wish that our Foreign Office and our government had more balls to come out and keep supporting, because they have a lot to offer and they want to offer it. And a large number of Sierra Leoneans have moved and moved here to the UK, and many of them moved in an area of London where they ended up joining the London Irish as TA. But to them, that was their natural home because they identified with that and what had happened at Rockall Creek. So the message was important, but the bonus was the hostages were rescued.
Yeah, absolutely. So on reflection, Gary, obviously going into the operation with the real probability that you weren't potentially going to come out of it, and it was known as Operation Certain Death among certain circles. What do you take away from it, and how has it affected you over the years and your recovery?
Yeah, thanks. I suffered with mental health, or struggled with mental health, probably around about 2010 sort of time. So it was well after the assault happened. But I do think that this assault sort of added to the compounded effect of various things I've done throughout my career, and it came to a culmination in 2010 where I needed to get some help. We didn't really back then have time to sort of talk about things, compress. You're on that training cycle, that train, deploy, get a few weeks off, train, deploy, get a few weeks off. So you didn't really have time to sort of get things off your chest and talk about them. Where the things have changed, I think, now, and people are starting to realise that that there are issues with people and their mental health, and they're trying to do something about it. So yeah, it added to that. I realised I had a problem, and as we all know, the first way to getting help is admit that you've got a problem yourself. Seek that help, whether it be professional help or assistance and help from your friends and your family, and understand. And become the patient. That's what I found really helps. Become the patient, and whether that be from a professional context, a clinical context, or friends or family assisting you with that, and then understand it takes time, but take every day at a time. So yeah, it definitely did add to me struggling with mental health. But once you go through the process and you accept the help and you do come out the other side, because you do, there is light. It's I'm sort of an example of that. Ever since I had the issues, if you want to call them issues, I got the assistance and the help. I promoted. I went back to Afghanistan, for instance. Back on the bike, sort of thing. You live with it, but you learn to live with it. To answer your question, it definitely added to what happened with me. But I think it was the compound effect of everything what's happened to me. This was just one of those events in my life.
Yeah, absolutely. And for you both as well, kind of reflecting points that you've taken away from it, or how you've kind of dealt with it. Obviously, Ian, we've spoke to yourself about kind of going back there and kind of sort of not reliving it, but sort of getting some sort of closure. Tim, yourself, obviously the death of 3 Special Forces soldiers at the time, 2 in training and 1 on the mission.
Well, I think, as Ian said, and the view that people would take in Special Forces, that's an all-volunteer organisation, and the risks, and that is one of the risks that happens in it. And I think everybody goes in with their eyes open, and so that the operation itself happened in September of 2000. I then was slated to take command of the Royal Irish Regiment, and I arrived in January of 2001. And I found it out an organisation that had suffered greatly, frankly, from that operation. It had lost its self-confidence. People were leaving. We were undermanned. I think I took a battalion over that was something like 250 undermanned. I then threw out 47 guys, mainly people who were associated with drug dealing and whatever, and turned the battalion around to a great extent. I think last time I spoke to you, I basically went to recruiting group, listened carefully what they had to say, and then did the exact opposite, and that worked really well. We ended up with a fully manned battalion, But for a long time, the Wimmock that was rescued sat over about 300 metres where we're sitting now in the barracks, and it sat behind the MT. And eventually we said it can't be repaired, and the REME took it away. But it sat there, and I think for some people that was a reminder. I think the odd person would go around and have a look at it, and I wished it wasn't there. But it took a long time for me to realise, when I arrived, initially I knew that was an issue, and talking especially in the sergeant's mess, that this had left a shadow. The fact that no one had received any recognition for the great courage which people had shown, and etc. And that was something that needed to be addressed. And I found it something that I then, by addressing it and talking to people about it and addressing it directly, and saying, you did the right thing. You carried on training. Your conduct in captivity was exemplary. And I think by addressing it and getting it out there, that was part of the road to recovery. And after that, my determination was to turn One Royal Irish around. And during my time, for good or for ill, it's a simple matter of history, that in January 2001, I took over a battalion that was 250 undermanned. We ended up 300 men undermanned, and a battalion which people were leaving in droves. And by addressing this head on, and what's more, taking things on. So we had an opportunity during the foot and mouth crisis where an exercise had been cancelled, and it was a Royal Air Force. It's their big operation. It involves 3 nations, but mainly RAF, with everything from AWACS aircraft to fighter to ground attack. The bit that was missing, because it was foot and mouth, is we couldn't have infantry on the ground. It was all about supporting that. And we were up in Scotland. I pointed out that actually where the exercise was meant to happen was in Campbellton. It was an American Air Force base, and it wasn't subject to foot and mouth regulations. And this was on the Sunday night. And we were down the pub with the brigade commander, who went on to be chief of the general staff, and the RAF squadron commander. And so the brigade commander said, so if I said get a rifle company, could you get a rifle company? And I'm like, yeah. And he said, are you serious? And I'm like, yeah. It was 9 o'clock at night, and I phoned my second in command here in Canterbury here and said, tomorrow morning I want A company out on the square ready to move, and I need B company ready to come within 12 hours after that. And he's like, you're kidding? I said, I'm not kidding. And that was addressing the whole thing where the Royal Irish had been left behind on the first deployment. A couple of the quartermasters who were from the old school and thought they knew better, and were like, it can't be done. And I said, what you need to do is get your way, and I phoned the 2 IC and said, tell them to come into the battalion headquarters, bring the keys and hand them over to the RQMS. They're the quartermasters now. And they're like, no, that's not what I meant. And I said to them, look, tell them there's one commanding officer and one Royal Irish, and they're fucking looking at them. Get your asses up here now. And so A company turned out on the square, and they didn't know what was happening, but the ammunition got broken out, and then buses turned up. And they thought, this is Tim Collins, it's one of his tests, one of his wacky tests. And then they got on buses and they drove down to RAF Manston. And they said, what will happen now is that, they'll say Index. And then they saw the C-130s landing. And like, holy shit, we're going to war. But we put 2 rifle companies up there within 36 hours. The first one was there on the ground, wasn't even 24 hours. It was about 18 hours. The second one followed up by about 24 hours with 2 rifle companies up there. So that was part of the repair process. People realised that we were getting better as a battalion. Everything that had gone wrong, we'd learned from it, and we're turning it round. And so it was. And we went on leave in the 21st of December 2002. And I'd been presented with a silver plaque to say farewell as commanding officer. And I went off. I'd been promoted full colonel, sent off to the Kosovo as the colonel in charge of deep operations. And the Gurkha company had said farewell to them. They were going off back to join 2nd Battalion Gurkha Rifles. And then during Christmas leave, so that was the 21st of December, on the 28th of December, I got a call from Land Command, from General Mike Jackson, to say, you're staying in command of 1 Royal Irish. 1 Royal Irish is the 1st Battalion that's going to be deployed to the Gulf for the liberation of Iraq. And by the way, you can keep the Gurkhas, because at that stage they still didn't know we were fully manned, and I wasn't letting on. We already had, so not only were Royal Irish was the only battalion in the army, had 4 rifle companies. There's a fully manned battalion, and we had a defence platoon, and we had a machine gun platoon fully strength. We were fully strength with, not only, we actually provided 16 Air Assault Brigade a 28-man defence platoon, because we were hiding blokes. But having recruited so well, I ended up leaving, I think, 12 or 15, 17-and-a-half-year-olds here behind, mostly Southern Irish kids here in Canterbury, because they couldn't deploy until they were 18. They were champing at the bit to go. But so we went from January 2001, when nobody wanted to be in that battalion and nobody was leaving, to 2003. January 2003, the battalion was overmanned, if anything, and I was making sure everybody could get deployed, even by sending defence platoons. And at one stage, people were starting to doubt this, and I think the Gurkhas wanted their rifle company back. But I said, the guys, when you get into theatre, never stop, never let them count you, just keep moving, so nobody can ever count you. But that was the sometimes good things come from bad experiences, and we had a very bad experience in having the hostages taken. But that turned out to be the 1st Battalion chosen for the liberation of Iraq 2 years later.
Well, it's clear to see that you've all gone on after the events that folded back in 2000 and had very successful careers. You've soldiered on for the remainder of your careers. And you've all kind of processed and reflected in your own way. I want to say thank you very much for joining me and for sharing these events. Obviously, it's not easy to recount what happened back then. But again, hopefully it's been beneficial for all of you involved in a way of closing the loop. You get to see different perspectives from sort of all angles, really. But thank you. And for the wider public, hopefully you've found this podcast a real good insight into Operation Barras. Thank you very much for joining us. Until next time.